And I'm going to take it a little bit different than the way that James presented it. He presented it a lot very clearly from the podcasting industry perspective, with lots of data, with lots of insight, with which he is really great at, being able to see that entire system and being able to talk with you about podcasting from that perspective. And I'm bringing it forth from the personal side of things, from the side of things of the human, from the cultural, from the impact that podcasting can have to the individual, and how that actually affects the industry a little bit more, speaking from a personal perspective. And when I say personal, I really am saying to you that it is going to be coming particularly for communities, women, and podcasting. So you're going to be able to see my screen here, all of my little things. And I'll be talking about women, podcasting, and community, starting off from a deep story of mine, so that you see what that meant to me, or podcasting has meant to me, and how that has taken me to where I am today. So my name is Elsie Escobar. I am the She Podcast co-founder. I'm also the Libsyn community manager, and I'm a podcasting Hall of Fame inductee. I am the one and only Latina that has been inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I'm also a podcaster. I've been podcasting since July 20. Oh gosh, look at this. It's July. It's almost I don't know how many years. I've been podcasting since 2006. So do the math. And I have 2 very active podcasts, and then I have a fledgling, very sad podcast that I started and just left because my life, it's hard. Podcasting is hard. Hopefully I'll be able to go back to doing something like that. But let me start first by a little bit of a story, because I don't want to take up too much time. I'd love to have conversation here, or some questions that come to me. So I fell in love with podcasting because I listened to the voices in my ears. And at the time that podcasting came into my life, I was not living the best life, if you will. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was doing what everybody else in Los Angeles does, which is pursuing an acting career at that time. I'm a trained stage actress, and I had moved to LA. I ended up waiting tables and teaching yoga, because that's exactly what working actors do, or wannabe working actors do in Los Angeles. But that really wasn't the unfulfilling part. And this is where I get to be a little bit vulnerable with you, and to share what the personal experience of podcasting is. At that time, I was in an unhealthy, very negative relationship with a partner. And I felt that I was trapped. I had gotten myself in a situation where I could not connect with anybody in a really deep way. I really felt that I had made decisions in my life now that I was now going to have to stick to for the rest of my life. And I had no way out. I was just there, and now I just had to essentially deal with it. And at that time, podcasting came into my life, and I started to hear voices in my ears as I connected with so many individuals that were living lives that were different than mine, that were expressing themselves and sharing stories, and letting me know that the world was much bigger than what I envisioned to be. In fact, some of the LA podcasters, which is at that time one of the groups that I connected with, because I'm always obsessive about finding out about people, I started to listen to every single podcast from the LA podcasters at that time. And they were all storytellers. They would tell stories in the way that I'm telling you this story right now, inside of my ears, stories of their lives in Los Angeles, things that they were doing in LA. And one of the podcasts specifically, this gentleman said something that really struck me when I was living my life, when I was like biking over to yoga class. He said something that triggered the possibility that my life could be different, that started the process of getting me out of where I was. Long story short, I did leave my situation. In fact, I left LA altogether. I just picked up and went one day. I mean, I'm condensing the story here, but I'm only telling you this because my story in podcasting did not begin behind the mic. My story in podcasting began as a listener, as somebody who connected to the people, as somebody who was able to then expand my life beyond what I was living at that time so that I could continue living a life that now I am super excited to have. But it all started from those voices in my ears. So I credit podcasting for what I say is saving my life. But now moving forward a little bit to talking about how that happened and how I connected with these folks so quickly, which leads me into community. And moving into the community aspect of it, I want to really touch that historically speaking, even from the beginning, podcasters had the ability to connect with their audiences in ways that possibly like radio or TV don't. And that was that there was always a dialogue, there was always a back and forth. So, all of the podcasters that I listened to at that time, and I'm saying like all of them, except maybe the corporate casts, like the ones that are more like the NPR types, the radio produced ones, they did not implement this. These were more the ones that were just starting out and starting to connect with audiences. All of them had some kind of get together with their own, with podcasters in those different areas. In fact, where I was, there was the LA podcasters that people got together. There were the San Diego podcasters and people got together. There were these groups all over the United States that would connect with groups that were in the UK. And you could start to hear that there were all of these small communities of podcasters, and they would all talk about it in their shows. And that for me was the first in of connecting with podcasters, that they talked about it in their shows. Then there were also listener meetups where a lot of the podcasters would have meetups in their places, to wherever it is that they lived, to have folks come in and meet together and just get to know their listeners. This also was communicated inside of each of and every one of the shows. So I thought, oh my gosh, one day I want to go to a listener meetup for insert whatever show I was listening to that time. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And lastly, part of it is that there were these connections that were opened up, particularly within shows, in the fact that I always felt that there was that back and forth, that dialogue that came through, which I'm going to take you through next. It's really about the culture of what podcasting was when it began and how it has expanded into what we have now, a little bit less so, but something that still resonates. It is that dialogue that from the beginning, again, a lot of these shows that I connected with all had a built-in ethos of being able to listen to their audience, that the folks that were behind the microphone weren't the ones that knew all the things, weren't the ones that were, this is what I say and this is what I do. But there was a dialogue that went back and forth, and the audience, the listeners, became part of the conversation as well. And how did this happen? Primarily through audio feedback, which is when you start to send, as somebody who's listening to a show or somebody that's consuming this content, your audience is then able to send you their voices so that the podcaster puts it on the show and it becomes part of the show. This happened all the time with the shows that I started to listen to, and it was done through phone, like phone services where you could leave a message in a specific phone number, and then people would download the audio files at that time and put it on their show. You could also record your voice, leaving a voice message, and then it would be sent over to the podcaster, and the podcaster would put it on the show. every podcast had their own email address so that you could email the show. And it was something that they constantly talked about. In fact, when I first started, the Gmail didn't exist. No, seriously, it didn't. And so what ended up happening is I listened to a podcast that was put on by Harvard University, and it was called, I think it was called Computing 101. And because at that time, anyway, let's talk about that another time. But I was listening to the show called Computing 101, and he was talking about this new service from Google that was this Gmail service. And at that time, it was invite only. And he said, if you would like to be invited to Gmail, please email me. And then he gave his Gmail account, and I emailed the professor from Harvard, and he gave me an invite to Gmail. And that's how I got in, which is so cool that at that time, anyway, now it's super easy. But just that ability for me to reach out to this professor from Harvard that was teaching this course, and he connected with me and immediately gave me access to something I would not have had access to if I wouldn't have emailed, was incredible. It's also how I connected with the person that I consider as my podcasting Yoda, if you will. His name is Victor Cajiao, and he started the typical PC user and the typical Mac user way, way back in the day. And we started corresponding back and forth. And he is the one that helped me with everything that I know to start a podcast. He walked me through step by step. I didn't really have to do too much research because he did that with me. All of that started via email. It started because they opened up their connection for me to be able to email them. And of course, at that time too, there was a lot of forums. Not as much today. I guess Facebook groups would be that at this time, but there were many different forums where people would go and talk to each other, and they weren't so spread out because now the industry has gotten so big. It was a little bit more smaller places where you could communicate and you would see the same folks that were constantly there. So one of those things that in meaning all of this communication for me was what really set the foundation for me to step into the world of podcasting and to, most importantly, recognize that I wasn't stuck in a world that was just isolated. And now I'm going to get over to the women aspect of it. So as a woman, a lot of the time, historically speaking, or the way that we are possibly society reflects back to us in a lot of different places outside of the US, or possibly, in all over the world. I come from El Salvador. I'm an immigrant to the United States. We moved to this country in 1980. I was Spanish speaking first. I learned, English when I came to this country. I was undocumented until I think for 6 years, until we finally got a green card. I did not become a U.S. citizen till it was in the year 2000 is when I chose to go through the process. And I'm sharing all this because, again, culturally, I was raised in one specific way. And again, podcasting gave me the opportunity to be able to consume ideas and to be able to empower myself, be able to really step into who I was as a woman through the privacy of my own ears. Nobody needed to know what I was listening to. Nobody knew what I was learning. I was able to learn about computers, technology. I used to download entire podcast about anatomy because at that time I was teaching yoga. Anytime that I wanted to learn something new, there was this incredible amount of information that was out there that I was able to put in my ears so that I could expand my horizon, if you want to put it that way. So the first thing that podcasting gave me as a woman was the freedom to expand my life, the freedom to make the choices that I wanted to. And also, one other thing that I did when I started to get the mic in front of me, when I was able to talk into the microphone, it really came. It came with the ability for me to have people not focus on the way that I looked, because being in Hollywood and always presenting one way into the world, and again, primarily being a woman, you are put into specific boxes. Oh, she looks like this. She is, and then they name the parts of you that fit into a mold. And whenever that mold is whatever they think deem it to be, then you can only be that thing because you are looked at in a specific way. Podcasting removed the visual from people. Podcasting gave me the ability to speak and lead with my words, lead with my thoughts, lead with who I was outside of how I looked, which for me was deeply freeing and so wonderful to be able to just know that I wasn't going to be looked at. And this is just something that I ever since I was a little girl, I hated it. In fact, I have t-shirts that say, "Don't look at me," because I have this. I never felt comfortable with the spotlight being super, super just on me. And I love the fact that I was able to lead with what I had to say and my voice above and beyond anything else. And also in that process, because I hadn't really spoken up too much in my real life, meaning that again, just the way that I naturally was raised. I wasn't really raised necessarily to speak up and to speak my mind and to take my voice out into the world. It was a little bit more calm. You need to sit down and just be quiet. And so I didn't have the skill set to be able to go behind the microphone and speak and have my words make sense or feel powerful when I spoke up. And I feel that sometimes this microphone is like a training wheel for real life, where I get an opportunity to practice behind the microphone when nobody's watching, when you're by yourself and you get to hear yourself in your ears. And then that gives you the opportunity to develop the skills to understand that your voice matters and you can speak it. And it doesn't feel so bizarro when you're saying things aloud. So that's what podcasting, at least for me as a woman, and I know that I'm not the only one that has felt this way in the past, that it becomes freeing to have a microphone in your face where you haven't been able to speak up in the past. And that in itself, just those aspects of it, gave me the ability to kind of blossom inside of an industry that at that time was just starting out. And to the point, it was primarily full of lots of men. There were many, many men all over the place. And I tended to be, generally speaking, one of the only women in a lot of these spaces. And because of that, I called a lot of attention simply because I didn't fit the mold of what everybody else was. And I've always been incredibly enthusiastic and about all things podcasting. So I step in all the time speaking about these things because it drives me so, it makes me so excited, and therefore it gave me the opportunity to continue to grow in this industry. Now, given the fact that it was primarily men, special places needed to be created because whenever you have a certain type of person inside of a space for a long period of time that holds a lot of power, that the same conversations tend to come up over and over and over again, and the same reactions tend to happen, and anything that is outside of that um, is a little bit there's a little bit of a resistance to that. And I remember when some of the Facebook groups, particularly because at that time, once it moved away from the forums, if you will, into more of the Facebook groups, um, whenever any, like, at least in our experience, and I'm adding here, that's Jessica Kupferman, my partner in crime for She Podcasts. We used to feel that whenever we would ask a technical question inside of these larger spaces, we would get a lot of technical answers where our eyes would just like grow like this big and go, I have no idea what those people said. And it was a little bit harder to understand why we were getting those responses. Or we would say, Let's pretend. I'm talking chocolate now just because it's easier. Should I get the dark chocolate or should I get the milk chocolate? That was the question, okay? And then in the group, they would answer, well, why are you having the dark chocolate or the milk chocolate? You should have white chocolate. White chocolate is the kind that you need to have. And so then we were like, but I really just want to know if I want the dark chocolate or the milk chocolate, not the white chocolate. And so we never would get the answer that we were asking for. So what we decided to do is create our own group where it is currently called She Podcast. We're over 20,000 women and non-binary that are part of this group. And in that space, we curated a space where we were able to then move from a place of who we were versus what we were taught. And that space always begins with more of a feminine end of things where there's a lot more dialogue, there's a lot more communication. And one thing that I feel our spaces, or at least the She Podcast space, is great at is that there really isn't very much dogma there. Part of it is that we recognize that for a lot of us that are, you know, historically not represented in many different areas, we have certain things that we have to deal with that a lot of other folks don't. Like, as I'm speaking to you at this moment, I don't know, my daughter is sleeping right in front of me because it is very early in the morning. Hopefully she is able to just continue to sleep. But we have to deal with a lot of different things where there's parameters. There's like, I don't have a special place to go. I don't really have the funds to be buying the fancy microphone. I don't know where I'm going to get another computer. I really need to be able to only record with my phone. And instead of moving from a place of you are not going to be able to do it because I can't believe you only have a phone or you can't get a proper XLR microphone or whatever you want to say, we work within the parameters of what the circumstances are for the woman or the non-binary person. And then we help them expand to take it to whatever level they want to, given their circumstances. And I think that that's what special spaces like She Podcast are able to do, where we're able to turn the conversation to lead from a different place, usually more of the passion, more of the connection between humans, more in the personal versus the larger. And in that way, we're able to support each other by those tiny, tiny little steps. As we continue on, though, I know that this is a story particularly about women in podcasting and having these special places that have communities that move from a specific place whenever they are for special populations. It doesn't in any way say that they are excluding everybody else. It just is a place where it's easier for us to be heard. It is easier to be understood. And in that realm, we are able to thrive so that we can bring that confidence back into the industry. And then getting to some of the stuff that James was talking about towards the end of his presentation, where he was talking about how podcasting is just becoming so big in so many different parts of the world. What tends to happen whenever there is more diversity, more difference in so many difference in the world and in our voices, that is again bringing forth historically excluded voices, is that the entire industry then starts to change and shift and see things from a different lens. And that is amazingly just so great. And at the same time, there's going to be a lot of resistance that comes from those that have always done the same thing in the same way and recognize things from the same angle for many, many years. There are a lot of folks that have been doing things for over a decade, following specific guidelines and specific rules. Whenever you do start to become more diverse, whenever historically excluded voices begin to be part of the conversation, they will immediately show you a different angle of the same conversation that you might not have seen in the past, and possibly challenge those that have been doing it the one way. And it might feel a little awkward and a little weird and a little like, we don't do that, or that's not true. And it becomes a little bit more of a pushback. So one of the reasons those special community spaces are great is because we come up and we speak up. And then whenever we get a little bit of that resistance and it like, oh gosh, because it's hard. It's hard when folks don't listen to you. It's hard when folks don't recognize that your voice matters. There are those special safe places where you can go and you can recharge, you can connect, you can feel safe, and you can come back out to do the work. So that is essentially me really quickly talking about the women and community and podcasting and what it was for me. So please feel free to stay in touch with me. You can follow me on Twitter at the Elsie Escobar. I also am primarily the force behind the Libsyn social media, which and you can follow Libsyn at LIBSYN. You can connect with me in all these other places. And one thing that I did not mention is, of course, She Podcasts Live. She Podcasts Live is a conference, a real life, like in-person conference that this is going to be our second year that is going on. It is centering women. It is not women only. It is centering women. So the only women are on stage, and everything that is put out is centering the feminine voice, but it doesn't mean that it excludes everybody else. It's just that that's where it's going. We really lead with the ability for you to recharge, those that are coming to conferences, to be able to really have an experience, to be able to relax, to be able to connect. It's kind of like a conference/spa. And but at the same time, you're still learning and growing and expanding, and it's really one of a kind. We're doing this in October. You can check it out at shepodcast.com/live. And I know that you're obviously, the audience here is not necessarily in the United States. We do have a digital component to it as well. But if you ever dream of going to a conference and this is like what rocks your boat, go ahead and check this out for yourself. And also, if you want a free month of podcast hosting, please use the code Podlines to get started with that. Yay.